Of correcting the Labour Party, we have another story, because on Tuesday the Labour Party were expected to rubber stamp their support for transgender women to be included on all women's shortlists. But this programme has learned that that announcement has been delayed so that arguments on all sides can be heard. The rights of the transgender community have also become part of a wider conversation in Westminster after the government backed calls to simplify the legal process for somebody to change their gender, as Greg Dawson reports.
This is Heather Pito.
I've always known I'm a woman. It was when I became a teenager that I really felt pressured to be who I was.
And at the next general election, she wants to make political history.
I'd like to be one of the first transgender MPs in Parliament.
But that ambition has propelled her and others to the centre of a significant row in the Labour Party after she was included on an all-women shortlist for selection as parliamentary candidate.
Well, I don't think it's an issue, to be honest. I think the local party decides and the best candidates will get through. So I don't think it's an issue. I think it's being made an issue by some people that are more anti-transgender, but local people don't seem to be worried.
Labour say they've always welcomed self-identifying trans women onto all-women shortlists, but that policy has recently come under attack. Enter the self-described radical feminists who descended on Parliament this week for a meeting they titled Transgenderism and the War on Women. They've been described as transphobic, a label they reject.
I can see already there are trans-identifying men what I feel are cynically using those positions. You know, you've got Heather Pito, who's the trans inclusionary officer of the Labour Party. He went onto an all-women shortlist.
The fact that you are referencing Heather as he against her wishes would be insulting to her.
Well, I could go on and on about preferred pronouns. Once we start using she for a man, we're blurring the distinction.
Venice Allen is a Labour member, but those views got her suspended. She knows what she says is offensive to the trans community, but makes no apology for it.
I really do want to have this conversation. Like I say, you don't have to agree with us, but you do have to listen to us, like the Labour Party. You know, they're not listening. I've tried to set up momentum events, Labour events. I've tried to meet with Jeremy Corbyn. I've tried to meet with other politicians.
Labour were supposed to formally clarify their support for trans women on all-women shortlists at a meeting at the party's HQ this week. We've been told that decision would have triggered the resignations of more than 200 female members. Then, yesterday, Labour told us that formal discussion was delayed until June. This is all a precursor to a much wider political debate going on, with the government committing to update the Gender Recognition Act. As the Prime Minister has explained, the changes would allow people to self-define their gender without the need for medical diagnosis.
We've set out plans to reform the Gender Recognition Act, streamlining and demedicalising the process for changing gender, because being trans is not an illness and it shouldn't be treated as such.
Now, since she made that speech at the Pink Awards last October, progress on those changes to the Gender Recognition Act seems to have slowed down. A consultation was expected in the autumn, but nothing surfaced. I've asked the government what's going on, and they just say in this very short statement that a consultation will be published in due course, but no date given. And our various requests to speak to politicians both in favour and opposed to these changes were all turned down, which came as little surprise to some.
I know journalists and I know politicians who have questions about this, who have doubts about it, who don't dare express those doubts, raise those questions, because they're worried that if they do, they'll be screamed at, they'll be accused of bigotry, transphobia, simply for asking questions.
James Kirkup has written a number of columns on the updates to the Act and isn't sure it's been properly thought through.
There are questions about access to safe spaces for women, like domestic violence refuges. There are questions about the collation of statistics on crime, on pay. They're questions that should be asked, debated, discussed and answered.
Heather Pito says the changes are long overdue, though, and hopes she can one day speak up for the rights of the trans community from the benches of the House of Commons.
As a feminist, I stand up to that and say, no, I will just be who I am. You know, I had the self-confidence that I'm a woman, and that always have been, and people should just accept me for that.
So the two significant issues to pick up with there about the Labour Party and also about the government's consultation on transgender rights. On the Labour Party, let me start with you, Matt. It does seem the Labour Party has got itself in a terrible tangle here about transgender women on all women shortlist, to the point where they can't even make a decision that was due this week. They've had to put it off until June.
Well, a self-identifying trans woman has never been disbarred from being on an all-women shortlist in the Labour selection. And I think that the consultation was about, as I understand it, it was about coming up with a form of words that actually...
yeah, but absolutely clarifying the position that trans women are eligible to be on all women shortlists. And it's caused such a row within the party, with 200 prominent members threatening to resign if that wording is put in, that the party seems to have been ducking the decision and kicking it into the long grass.
The conversations I've had with the leader's office suggest that that's not the case. It's actually just, they're still consulting on it. They're still consulting on exactly what the form of words will be, and there's no actual plan, as far as I'm aware, to stop trans women self-identifying and being on a women's shortlist.
Can I just ask how many trans women are applying to be on all women shortlists?
Good question. I'm not sure.
I suspect the answer is absolutely zero, or less than on the fingers of this hand.
Peter in the film was one of them. There are several.
There may be several, but I suspect that they are less than on the fingers of this hand. And I think Jeremy Corbyn himself probably has quite sensible doubts as to whether so much energy should be going into a debate which affects so few people, not for a minute disparaging how difficult it must be to be in that situation. I mean, there would be a simpler way of solving this, which is just not to have all women shortlists and select the candidates who are the best for the job.
It's also about sort of whether Labour MPs have access to the kind of Jo Cox Women in Leadership programme, whether they can stand as women's officers in local parties. I mean, my personal view is I think, in fact, what Labour did here was they jumped the gun by saying, yeah, that's absolutely fine. All self-identifying trans women can have access to these full rights. And actually, I think it's quite welcome to have a consultation. You know, politics is the art of persuasion, and there was no real attempt by the Labour leadership to really bring the party, bring some of the sort of feminists who...
I mean, there are radical feminists in the party who will take more than a bit of gentle persuasion to get accustomed to the idea that people who were born men should be on an all-women short.
Well, that's right, but as we saw in the VT, you know, they're at least asking for an opportunity to be heard and for that debate to be had. So I think it's quite welcome that there'll now be a consultation.
And of course, it's not just the Labour Party who seem to have kicked this issue on a bit. We don't know what's happened to the government's consultation on making it easier to self-identify as a man or a woman. That's going to be a difficult one for the government, isn't it, Isabel Oakeshott? I mean, we remember the culture wars within the Tory party that David Cameron fought over gay marriage.
Absolutely, and this is even much more complicated and such a sensitive issue. It is so easy, and I'm sure I've been guilty of it myself, to get the language wrong on this, to upset people. And I can only imagine the Prime Minister's qualms about opening this can of worms within her own party, where there will be people who are incredibly off-message about it. So it doesn't surprise me at all that they're sort of trying to push this into the long grass. And in all honesty, there are slightly bigger issues to worry about.
I mean, you are talking about 2,000-3,000 people in a party of 650,000. It's a rounding error. It's not huge. It's not
in the Labour Party you're talking about.
Party, you know, it's a small minority of women who don't believe in trans rights. That's it.
But I mean, it was interesting to hear Theresa May talking about the government's consultation on this. And that was a very clear statement that she made at that Pink News conference, saying that she wanted to streamline this, that trans was not a mental health issue. I mean, it was a very strong commitment to trans rights that she put there. She didn't have to do.
No, she didn't at all. I thought that was fascinating that she went as far as that. But it's not unprecedented. I mean, Ireland, Argentina, Colombia, Malta have changed their processes to depathologise it so it's merely a legal process. And I think really that's what the government is getting at. At the moment, my understanding is for a trans person to legally change gender, they have to live as their desired gender for 2 years. They then have to have psychiatric evaluations, medical opinions from 2 doctors in tests that some of them have complained have been very intrusive and traumatising. So I think the idea of streamlining it and making it more a legal process, it can be done. We've seen from precedents abroad.
All right, well, stay with us because we're going to carry on talking to you throughout the rest of the programme. But it is coming up